So we have until 5:23. I call Chris Evans.
Stories, it's always a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Thank you for calling me to speak in this debate which I have called about the welfare of racing greyhounds. Coming from a family of bookmakers and having worked in the industry myself, I feel I have been around horses and dogs all of my life. Indeed, after setting up the betting shop with the race cards and the newspapers, writing the off slips which signified the start of the race, my day would officially start with a piercing bell which would mean the 11 AM greyhound race from Romford or Walthamstow was about to begin. Each Christmas, our works outing would take us for a night of dog racing just down the M4 to Swindon racetrack. Let me be clear, greyhound racing, when it is well regulated, can be a fun pastime. Even though it was a bit before my time, I can still remember the names of Ballyregan Bob and Skirlow Champ when the races were shown on that staple of Wednesday nights, BBC Sports Night. Over the years I have known a few greyhound owners and trainers. In the main, they are dog lovers who treat their animals well. Greyhound racing stories in the UK supports in excess of 7,000 jobs and is sustained by over 4,000 owners. In addition, the industry generates over £55 million in taxation. However, there are two major problems with greyhound racing, which is having a serious impact on the dogs themselves: prize money and welfare. The betting industry is inextricably linked with the sport of greyhound racing. As a betting product, greyhound racing has never been more popular. Some £2.5 billion is staked on the outcome of greyhound races each year. William Hill own and operate two tracks, one at Sunderland and another at Newcastle. I welcome the fact they pay over £2 million on a voluntary basis to the British Greyhound Racing Fund. It is an example which many betting companies who make profits out of the industry should follow. However, that is simply not the case with many online operators, including betting exchanges, who do not contribute a penny to the industry. Whereas horse racing is subject to the Horse Racing Levy Board, which collects a statutory levy from the horse racing business of bookmakers to be distributed to the improvement of horse racing and breeds of horses, along with the advancement of veterinary science and education. Greyhound racing, on the other hand, could be termed to be its poor cousin. It only has a voluntary levy, not enshrined in law, which sees a percentage of off-course betting turnover, currently 0.6% of turnover, returned to the sport. It amounts to approximately £12 million a year and is used to finance welfare and integrity work, plus the promotion of the sport and commercial activities. Greyhound racing provides a core betting sport, but unlike horse racing, which is thriving, attendance at many tracks is dwindling. The Independent Greyhound Board of Great Britain regulates the sport and maintains its integrity and well-being. I commend them on their decision to ensure all greyhounds are looked after, and microchipping of the animals means owners are always traceable. I have argued in the past that all dogs, regardless of breed, whether a working dog or a family pet, should be microchipped. In the summer, my own dog went walkabout and would have been lost for good had I not microchipped him as a pup. To see the industry lead the way can only be a good thing. However, low prize winnings put pressure on breeders, trainers and racetracks. They have to put on more races to make greyhound racing pay. More races mean more pups and more retired greyhounds, who sadly been abandoned after their racing days are over. Now, I want to make it clear again, it's no good tarring everybody with the same brush. In the main, trainers and dog owners and racetrack owners are people who love dogs and love greyhound racing. But there is a small minority who are causing problems. In 2004, Ms. Stories, the greyhound had to be put down when he was found in an extremely distressed state by a member of the public on a mountainside between Fockrue and Bargoed in the Rumney Valley. Well, I don't represent those two villages. I do represent the lower part of the Rumney Valley as part of Islam. The dog had been shot with a nail gun, had its ears, which were probably tattooed, cut off to stop identification. And I've also read this is common practice in Ireland, even though, as I know, the Minister doesn't have jurisdiction in Ireland. In 2010, the Department of Energy, Food and Rural Affairs adopted a system of self-regulation. When this was instigated, we were promised an end to the abuses of the past. Abuses like the one reported by the Sunday Times in 2006. This report found that for 15 years, over 10,000 healthy but unwanted greyhounds had been shot with a bolt gun and buried in a garden. This unofficial abattoir and graveyard was servicing licensed greyhound trainers. This practice was part and parcel of the greyhound racing industry. The chairman of the British Greyhound Racing Board admitted this was very plausible for similar operations to be happening but uncovered. And I will say, progress has been made, and I commend those efforts by the greyhound racing industry to do that. However, according to the Society of Greyhound Vets, the very dimension of the track and the all-weather conditions that greyhounds are forced to race in lead to high injury rates. Greyhounds suffer bone fractures, skin trauma, lacerations, and a host of other problems. Many require euthanasia. Most damning of all, though, Chair, each and every year there are still thousands of greyhounds who are healthy, who could be rehomed, who could lead happy and long lives, being needlessly and horribly put to sleep. The Associate Parliamentary Group for Animal Welfare estimates that a minimum of 4,728 racing greyhounds are unaccounted for each year. The majority of these are destroyed. The APGAW report, and this also states that this figure is likely to be a significant underestimation of the true scale of the problem of unwanted dogs being destroyed. Chair, we are now 4 years into self-regulation, and the problem with the racing industry is still prevalent. It's not like ministers do not know. The APGAW, Lord Donoghue, commissioned by the industry, the RSPCA, Greyhound Rescue Wales, and the League Against Cruel Sports have all shown time and again that some greyhounds lead a life of abuse, neglect, and ultimately early deaths. In a wide-ranging and comprehensive report, A Mandate for Change, the League Against Cruel Sports outlines how a new regulatory system can work. Such a system could improve the lives of greyhounds and make this sport fulfil its obligation to racing dogs. However, any new system must be based on, firstly, evidence, transparency, and in the public interest. The 5-year review of the statutory instrument conducted by DEFRA needs to be open to the public. I invite the Minister to commit to this in his remarks. Once and only once we have the full facts in the open, action needs to be taken to ensure the welfare of greyhounds. Yes.
Thank him for giving way. He's making a very powerful speech. Does he agree that there needs to be more statistics about the fate of greyhounds, and does he welcome the moves by charities to start doing this on a basis that the industry itself seems not to want to do?
Yes, I welcome that, and I think it's still worrying that so many greyhounds have gone missing, and how they begin their lives and how they end them as well. And I go back to the case of that greyhound from my part of the world being found on the side of the mountain. His ears, you can only conclude, were cut off, not to identify who he was, and that was a terrible, terrible incident. Once we have all the facts in the open, there needs to be 6 changes. I would be grateful to hear the Minister's thought on each of these. The creation of an independent welfare regulatory body. This will oversee all greyhound racing, both licensed and independent, and including representatives from animal welfare organisations. 2. Full transparency. Greyhound racing should be required by law to disclose welfare information at the national and track level each quarter to the regulatory body. 3. The use of drugs like testosterone and anabolic steroids on greyhounds must be prohibited. 4. Greyhound passports. The welfare regulator must be able to track every dog from birth. This will end the enigma of the thousands of greyhounds going missing each year. 5. Rehoming. There needs to be a statutory requirement on tracks, trainers and owners to rehome all racing greyhounds. 6. Breeding controls. The creation of a licensing regime for British breeders, together with joint initiatives between DEFRA and the devolved nations to tackle overbreeding. These are simple changes, ones that ministers could achieve this side of the election if it so wished. The Minister must answer whether this government will allow this sorry state of affairs to continue. Now, while the government must step up to the plate, and I urge the Minister to do that today, I would say this to the betting industry. Even though it has come, I believe, over the years, it has come in for unfair criticism all the time I've been here. That does not stop me from being a critical friend as someone who worked in the industry. Just like the horse racing levy, greyhound racing should have the same thing. Those who make money out of racing should give something back, in much the same way as William Hill does. Therefore, rather than a voluntary levy, this should be put on a statutory footing if the betting companies will simply not play ball. The choice to me is simple. An independent welfare regulation system, backed up by legislation, funded by a greyhound levy, or racing greyhounds continuing to face some of the horrible situation and conditions they do now. I look forward to hearing the Minister's thoughts.
Ian Lavery.
Thank you, Mr. Dorries, and can I first of all congratulate my honourable friend for bringing this timely debate to the Chamber, and as ever it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'm a greyhound owner and I love greyhounds, and I take great exception to people who know little about this wonderful sport, who classify me as a terrorist in sport because I want to race these wonderful animals. I've had lots and lots of emails as the co-chair of the all-parliamentary group for greyhounds. I've had lots of emails from people from across Europe, really, saying how bad of an individual I am because I support this great sport. It's a sport which is widely watched and loved by millions of people, not just here in the UK, but across the globe. So as I say, I really take exception to anybody who suggests to me that I'm not looking after the... I've had hundreds of greyhounds, fast ones, slow ones who have never met the track, ones who have reached the age of 5 years of age. Every one of the animals I've ever had, I've ever been associated with, I've looked after from the day they came into my ownership till the day that they sadly pass on. And the vast majority of owners do the responsible thing. And of course I accept that there's people out there that don't do the responsible thing. It's a great sport, Mr. Dorries, but it's tarnished by, should I say, a secret few and a murky past, whereby my honourable friend mentioned the issue in Seaham a few years ago, where up to 10,000 dogs, mainly greyhounds, but they weren't all greyhounds, were found to have been killed by an individual. I mean, that brought tears not just to my eyes, but to everybody's eyes who had anything to do with the sport. It took the sport back 30 and 40 years. What an absolute disgrace and outrage that was. I think that we've probably moved on quite a lot since then. In fact, we have. And I think it's right just to say that when we talk about greyhounds and greyhound racing, we've all heard the great tales about stopping your dog from running with pork pies and putting elastic bands around its feet and all these things, painting greyhounds so they don't look like the same one that's running. If only but a few of them were true, it would be half amusing. But it's just people who try to besmirch what I see as a brilliant sport that continue to perpetuate some of these myths because they're great tales to tell. And in the past, as I mentioned, we've had plenty of instances where we've seen greyhounds and lurchers as well, by the way, lurchers and dogs of that type of breed found on the hillsides, like my honourable friend mentions, and it's an outrage. It brings tears to everybody's eyes. And again, every time there's a single greyhound or animal left like that, it takes the sport back 10 years. So we need to move forward. And of course we've got a massive problem with welfare. The statistics show that. But it doesn't mean to say we should be looking to ban this sport, because it's a fantastic sport enjoyed by many people across the globe, enjoyed by plenty of people, owners, just spectators, up and down the breadth of this country. 30 tracks or more we've got here in the UK. But we've got to address the welfare problem, because every time there's a positive story about greyhound racing, like the Towcester, I should say, a track which opened only 2 weeks ago, officially on Saturday night, what a great event that was. But it's always tarnished by a welfare issue. We can make massive steps, but all the positive steps are always tarnished by welfare. And we shouldn't turn our backs on the welfare issue, because it's extremely, extremely important. We need more transparency in the sport, as has already been suggested. At this point in time, if you buy a greyhound, you get the greyhound, you get a passport. Every time the greyhound runs under rules, then that passport's marked. Every greyhound now, since the 2010 Act, regulations I should say, every greyhound now is microchipped. So there's a complete trail of ownership and details with regards to that individual greyhound microchip, and dogs are not allowed to run unless they're microchipped. That's a shining example of welfare in all types of animal, by the way, and I think that the sport were a leading light in that, and something which we should accept. Since the greyhound regulations of 2010 and the Donoghue review, for example, there was the introduction of compulsory microchipping, which I've explained. Also, the fact that every animal, every greyhound track would need a vet to be present during racing time.
Mr. Lavery, you have had over 6 minutes, and there is another member wishing to speak as well as the Minister to respond. So if you could wind up, that would be...
Thank you very much, and I thank the Minister and my honourable friend for allowing it. What I would just say is we've got to work together, Mrs. Dorries, the trainers, the owners, the GBGB, the GTA, the Dogs Trust, the RGT, everybody's got to pull together, tackle the welfare issue, and put greyhound racing on a firm footing for the future.
Andrew Rosendale.
Thank you, Mrs. Dorries. It's a pleasure to serve under your chair. And I'd like to add my thanks to the member for Islwyn for giving us the opportunity to discuss this important issue. And also my friend from Wansbeck. We work together as co-chair of the All-Party Greyhound Group. But I, of course, come from Romford. It's a greyhound racing town. I've grown up with the Greyhound Stadium in my constituency and where I've always lived. So for me it's very important that we get this right. We support greyhound racing, but as both my colleagues have spoken of, it's important that we also uphold the importance of the welfare of the animals. And I'd like to focus a bit about that in my brief remarks today. The greyhound, of course, is a remarkable athlete. It's one of the oldest canine breeds. It's mentioned in the Bible, in Chaucer, in Shakespeare, and often has been owned by members of the royal family. The greyhound industry in the UK is thriving and is an exciting industry. It not only brings in £55 million in taxation per annum, it also supports over 7,000 jobs linked to 30 or so racing tracks around the country. Greyhound racing is a traditional British pastime, and for many around the UK, I think this is something that they spend a lot of their life being involved with, and it's very important we don't take that away from them. And let me state, as chairman of the All-Party Greyhound Group, that whatever we feel about the issue, the important thing is that we never forget about the welfare of the 8,000 dogs which enter and leave the sport every year. The sport itself must be supported, but only on the basis that the dogs are properly looked after during their racing days and when they finish racing. I'm pleased that much progress has been made by the industry since the welfare of greyhound racing regulations were brought in 2010. The Greyhound Board of Great Britain has maintained the standards which afford it UCAS accreditation. All racing greyhounds are microchipped, and under the GBGB rules of racing, owners are responsible for their greyhounds when their racing days come to an end. In addition, it conducts vigorous anti-doping regime, taking over 9,000 samples a year. Of these, well over 99% are negative. And charities such as the Retired Greyhound Trust, of which I am a trustee and proud to be a vice president, serve to further the welfare of greyhounds when their racing days are over. The RGT is the largest single-breed rehoming charity in Britain, and last year found homes for 3,742 greyhounds. Unfortunately, the RGT and other charities are simply unable to help all the dogs which leave racing, and I welcome any assistance that sport is able to give to these charities in this respect, and the Honourable Member for Islwyn made that emphasis very clear. The recent report, however, into greyhound racing in the UK, which was produced by the League Against Cruel Sports, has raised many concerns, and whilst it is important for the sport to be held to account, it is, in my opinion, that this report does not represent necessarily all the facts as they truly are, and in some cases uses data which is simply not correct. For instance, the report claims that most greyhounds spend 95% of their time confined to a kennel, when in truth it is that they spend 95% of their time at a kennel, because quite simply that is where they reside and where they have access to paddocks, runs and walks on a daily basis. I do not believe that twisting the facts in this important matter is helpful to the debate, and we should be careful not to take information on face value without checking for sure if it's based on fact and not just based on hearsay. The Greyhound Board of Great Britain is working with the Greyhound Forum to improve transparency over the information on industries and trackside euthanasia rates, which means that this information is now available to many animal welfare organisations. However, I know that many of these organisations would like to see this transparency increased, and for the GBGP to further outside understanding of injuries which greyhounds sustain and remedies taken. It is also seen as important that GBGB share information about the numbers of greyhounds which retire each year and exactly where these dogs go, and perhaps that is one area in which the industry could work more closely with the Greyhound Forum. And in closing, Mrs. Doris, if I may say this, the greyhound industry and the Greyhound Board of Great Britain are insistent on their commitment to the welfare of the animals with which they work, and to retain the public support for greyhound racing, and of all those who care about the well-being of the animals, I strongly urge them to continue along the path of greater transparency.
Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Doris, and I also would like to congratulate the Honourable Member Iselwyn for raising this issue, and I was particularly interested to hear of his background and experience in this particular matter, as well as the experience, very direct experience, from the Honourable Member for Wansbeck. And also I know my Honourable friend, the Member for Romford, has got a long-standing record championing animal welfare issues, and clearly has followed this issue particularly closely as well. And the treatment of racing greyhounds, both during and after their racing lives, is also a matter of concern for the public. And I think this debate is also very timely because I'll be able to say a few words about what the government will be doing on greyhound racing over the coming months, and in particular our plans for a review of the current regulations in the early part of next year. First, though, I will give way.
Thank the Minister for giving way. Earlier this year I took my constituent Trudy Baker, who's a prominent member of the charity Great Exploitations, to see Lord Demoily, the Minister. On the 1st of April he wrote to me promising the set-up of a review group for the 2010 regulations. Has that group been set up, and if so, when will it report?
Minister.
Well, the original, as I was going to come on to say, the original legislation envisaged a review in 2015. I can say that work towards that review has already begun with officials, and the intention, as I was going to say later, is that we will shortly be going out and having a discussion with the stakeholders and those involved in greyhound racing before going to a wider public consultation after that. I did have the opportunity myself to talk to my little friend, the Lord Demoily, who leads on this particular issue within DEFRA, and I know he's visited greyhound racetracks himself and met many different stakeholders already to discuss these particular issues. But I wanted, Mrs. Doris, to first of all set out the current legislative framework covering the welfare of greyhounds in England. This is, of course, a devolved matter, but it is a reality that the majority of greyhound tracks in Britain, some 30 out of the 34 tracks in Britain, actually operate in England. There are a further 3 tracks in Scotland and 1 in Wales. The majority of those 30 tracks in England, 24 in total, are currently affiliated to the Greyhound Board of Great Britain, and which, following the 2007 report into greyhound racing led by Lord Donoghue, has been the main governing body of the sport since January 2009. There are, of course, a further 6 tracks that are currently not affiliated to the Greyhound Board of Great Britain. These are the so-called independent tracks, which tend to be smaller tracks, and they race independently of the GBGB. The welfare standards for all racing. Yep.
Just a point of clarification. Does the Minister mean rather than affiliated, but licensed by?
That's right. I mean, if they're affiliated, my understanding is that they are affiliated, they are licensed by the Greyhound Board of Great Britain. Those that are independent, and they tend to be the smaller ones, are then directly licensed by the relevant local authority. It's important also to note that welfare standards for all racing greyhounds in England are covered by the Animal Welfare Act 2006 and also the Welfare of Racing Greyhounds Regulations 2010. The Animal Welfare Act 2006 is a wide-ranging act, but it allows action to be taken where there is evidence of cruelty to an animal or a failure to provide for that animal's welfare needs. This includes, for instance, where greyhounds are kept away from the track, such as at trainers' kennels, which is often flagged as a point of concern among some animal welfare groups. Further to these general provisions, which apply everywhere, the welfare standards at all greyhound racing tracks in England are specifically covered by the Welfare of Racing Greyhounds Regulations 2010. These regulations, introduced in April 2010, require that all tracks must do the following. Firstly, they must have a vet present at all races, race trials and sales trials, with all greyhounds inspected by the vet before being allowed to run. Secondly, they should be provided with suitable kennelling. Thirdly, these regulations require all greyhounds to be microchipped and earmarked before they can race or trial. And finally, they must keep records of all dogs raced or trialled at the track and also any dogs injured during a race, trial or sales trial. These standards are regulated either by the track's local authority, as I pointed out, for independent tracks, or secondly, in the majority of cases, those 24, by the Greyhound Board of Great Britain. However, GBGB are only allowed to regulate these standards on the basis that they are accredited by the United Kingdom Accreditation Services, otherwise called UCAS, and this is for the audit of greyhound tracks against the standards required by the Welfare Racing Greyhound Regulations 2010. And it might help at this point if I briefly discussed what we mean by the term self-regulation. I know the Honourable Member for Islwyn talked about the fact that this is still very much self-regulated. I don't think it's quite as simple as that, because I think the position's actually firmer than simply having a voluntary code. Prior, obviously, to the introduction of the regulations in 2010, the industry was very much self-regulated in the way that most people would understand the term. There were no specific statutory requirements for greyhound racing tracks. The industry set down its own welfare rules of racing, and there was no independent external scrutiny of how the National Greyhound Racing Club, which was the main industry regulator at the time, enforced its own rules. However, following the 2007 Donoghue report and the subsequent introduction of the regulations in 2010, the minimum conditions required for all greyhound tracks in England are now set down by Parliament in regulation. And apart from local authorities, if any organisation wishes to regulate the standards themselves, then they must have UCAS accreditation to do so. The GBGB is currently the only body certified in this way by UCAS, and it ensures that there is now external independent oversight of the enforcement work that the GBGB carries out. So while the current situation is often described as self-regulation, clearly 2010 marked a break with what had gone before, and I would like to say that I think what we actually have is a sort of statutory form of regulation, but which is enforced by an industry body, but which is then itself audited by an independent body established within government. And it might be worth my while saying a little bit more about UCAS accreditation. The current role of UCAS, which is recognised by the government as the sole UK organisation for the accreditation of certification, testing and inspection bodies. This is done through internationally agreed standards. UCAS accreditation provides an assurance of the competence, impartiality and integrity of assessment bodies. And as UCAS accredits GBGB as a certification body, the government, I think, can have confidence that the GBGB is effectively monitoring and verifying animal welfare standards as defined within the rules of the regulations established in 2010. UCAS's accreditation process determines the technical competence and integrity of organisations acting as those assessment bodies. Before UCAS accredits any organisation, it will be subject to intensive audit to ensure compliance with the international standard of certification, including witnessing of the organisation's own assessment activities. And accredited organisations are subject to annual surveillance visits and full reassessment after 4 years. Organisations found not to be acting in accordance with their accreditation can have their accreditation suspended or even withdrawn. Should the Greyhound Board of Great Britain ever lose their accreditation, the 2010 regulations would automatically remove the powers that it has to regulate the standards set out in the 2010 regulations, and all GBGB tracks in England would then require a licence from their local authority. I should also point out that if anyone has any concerns about how the Greyhound Board of Great Britain is applying welfare standards, as defined within the rules of those 2010 regulations, they can report those to UCAS. UCAS has the powers to investigate any such concerns if they are reported to them. And since the Greyhound Board of Great Britain was accredited by UCAS in March 2010, I know that officials in DEFRA have been told that since that time, UCAS has actually received no complaints about the efficacy with which the Greyhound Board of Great Britain has approached its duties. I wanted to say a little bit about the 5-year review, which we touched on earlier with one of the interventions. When the regulations were introduced in 2010, previous ministers in the last government committed to reviewing them after they had been in force for 5 years. As the House will be aware, all new regulations now come with statutory 5-year review clauses anyway, but it was always a feature of these particular regulations, even under the last government and even before the statutory requirement to review regulations every 5 years came in place. It was always the intention to review them after 5 years. So that review is actually due in April next year, in 2015. But as I said, work on the review has already begun. We aim to go out to key stakeholders early in the new year to collect the evidence that we need to assess the effectiveness of the regulations. And once we've independently collected and considered that evidence, DEFRA will go out to a wider public consultation. But I have to say that is most likely to commence after the election, given that we will very quickly be into the end of March and a PERDA period. And I think as well it's important, given the strength of view on these issues, that we don't have a quick consultation that gets lost in the run-up to the next general election. This is an important issue. I don't think we need to rush it, and I think provided we've started the engagement with stakeholders before the election, we should actually allow plenty of time for people to respond to a public consultation after the general election. Now that review will obviously be looking at how effective the regulations have been, and it can look, first of all, at the self-regulatory elements of the regulations and how the current approach adopted by GBGB is working. Secondly, it can look at the requirement to collect injury statistics and how they can then be used. And thirdly, I think they could also, in this review, look at the traceability of greyhounds after they've left the sport, because I think one of the biggest concerns that is often raised about the current situation, and the Honourable Member for Islwyn highlighted this, is that there are sometimes estimates of around something between 2,000 and 4,000 greyhounds a year where nobody's quite sure where they end up. We know that there are many, many excellent charities that help to rehome greyhounds that have left racing, but there is some concern about some of the others. And the Honourable Member for Islwyn actually mentioned a number of issues that he'd like to be addressed in that review, and I think all of those could indeed be covered in that review. For instance, talking about the importance of independent welfare oversight and whether there could be other welfare charities involved with that. I see no reason at all why that couldn't be explored through the review. I think it's exactly the kind of thing that we should do. He also mentioned the importance of transparency on statistics. And we know that the regulations do require now the Greyhound Board of Great Britain to require all of those tracks to record instances of injuries, and I know many people say that those should then be published or should be submitted to the GBG and maybe published so that there's transparency there. Again, I think these are all valid points which can be addressed through the review. The Honourable Member for Romford highlighted the issue of doping and the use of drugs, and I think this is a very good point. We should recognise that the use of doping and the use of drugs in this context would already be a breach of the Gambling Act 2005. The Gambling Act, the Honourable Member will know, given his background in this, sets out many provisions in this regard. But we should recognise as well that the Greyhound Board of Great Britain has done some good work in this area. They have, I think, taken it quite seriously, spending over £640,000 a year on drug sampling and research to ensure that they're able to detect these substances, as the Honourable Member for Romford pointed out. Finally, he mentioned an issue around overbreeding. And I do think that this is an issue in many breeds where, and greyhounds is not the only example of this, where actually the Kennel Club have started to become alert to this particular problem, some of the dangers and the welfare impacts of overbreeding. And I know that the Kennel Club have been doing some work in this particular regard. And I'm sure that when we have that review, organisations like the Kennel Club and other animal welfare organisations who have themselves done some good work in the area of overbreeding may well want to contribute to that. So in conclusion, Mrs Doris, I believe we've had a very good debate, a very well-informed debate from honourable members who've got a lot of experience in this particular issue. And I'm sure that many of the points that have been raised will be exactly pertinent to the review that we are about to commence, first with stakeholders and then with the wider public in the course of the next 6 months. So I'd like to congratulate again the Honourable Member for bringing this debate and also for all the very important contributions we've had. Thank you.
Order the question is that the sitting now be adjourned.